Hi, I'm Scott. Welcome to Synth Stuff. Today we're going to be talking about MIDI routing, and not just MIDI routing in general, but as it applies to the iConnectivity mioXL. Coming up next. So when you have your synths connected via MIDI to your DAW computer or to each other, it means that you can control one synth from another synth. MIDI connectivity as applies in the DAW means you can simply control one synth from another synth, or maybe from a computer, or lights, or anything that works with MIDI can be controlled with anything else pretty much that works with MIDI. MIDI as a standard was created in the early 1980s by a consortium. I think it was definitely Roland, Sequential Circuits. I think Yamaha had a part in that as well. And it was truly a universal standard that was planned out so well that even today in 2022, 40 years later, it still runs pretty much exactly as it did in 1982. MIDI originally was set up as a daisy chain system, so you could have one cable that ran from this synthesizer to this one, and then from this one to this one, and this one to this one, and so on. And each of these synthesizers would listen on a different MIDI channel. You had 16 different channels. So if I sent MIDI data to channel 1, it would activate this synthesizer, and if I sent it to channel 2, it would activate this one, and so on. And each one would listen to only its MIDI channel, and any data that it saw for a different channel that it wasn't listening to would just pass on down the line. Of course, there are problems because we're talking about 1980s serial data. It's not overly fast, it's not like USB today, so latency crept in. When each synthesizer listened to the MIDI and then had to say, oh, no, not for me, pass it down, and then you had 16 of those. By the time it got to the end of the 16th one, you could have a little bit of delay or latency. And you could also have two synthesizers listening on the same MIDI channel. If this was set up to listen to channel 2 and so was this one, and I sent data to channel 2, you would play both synthesizers. Of course, technology marches on, and we got more and more complex synthesizers, things like the Phantom and the Montage, that have multi-timbral engines and can do so much that they listen on multiple different MIDI channels. They can listen to all 16, so they consume all the MIDI channels for themselves. Even the Hydrasynth Deluxe here listens on multiple MIDI channels because it has multiple engines inside. So when you have a synthesizer like the Phantom that listens on all 16 MIDI channels and it has none left over for anything else, how do you hook up all these synthesizers? So back in 1980, you only had one MIDI network, and if you had a computer like maybe an Atari ST that had a built-in MIDI interface, you only had one, so you had to connect everything up to that one MIDI interface. Today, because we have these greedy synthesizers that use up all the MIDI channels, we have to have separate MIDI connections for individual synthesizers, and that of course gets around the latency problem as well, because these synthesizers can transmit a ton of data, things like polyphonic aftertouch, a tremendous amount of digital data being transmitted that can actually slow down the data for all the other synths, so having an individual channel dedicated just for each synthesizer really makes sense. Most of these new synthesizers also work with USB, and DAW computers will automatically see especially class-compliant MIDI devices when they're plugged into your computer as a MIDI device without having a MIDI interface at all. So in theory, you could connect all these synthesizers that have USB ports and just plug them into your computer as USB devices, and everything should work just fine. However, it's not that simple because USB devices, and particularly synthesizers that may have multiple controllers in them, the Montage, the System 8, they have multiple USB controllers inside, and they will appear as multiple devices in your computer, and each of those requires something called endpoints. Now, your computer has a limited number of USB endpoints. For Intel computers, it's 127. For AMD Ryzen computers, it's more like 1,000. So this is not a problem that really applies to Ryzen computers, but for Intel-driven computers, absolutely it's an issue where individual computers have a limit as to how many USB endpoints they can have. An endpoint isn't necessarily a single device. It could be this device is using up 16 endpoints. The Montage uses up a tremendous amount of endpoints. even just a USB hub can use up multiple endpoints. So you can quickly run out of endpoints if you plug in too many USB devices, and many computers won't even boot if you have too many USB devices plugged in. Sometimes it'll just, when you try to start it up, your computer will say unable to connect USB device, not enough resources. And that's a good indication that you have run out of endpoints. So running USB back to the computer isn't necessarily a great way of connecting up MIDI if you have a lot of synthesizers, and that's precisely the issue I came up against with my studio. So when I rebuilt my studio, I knew I couldn't connect everything via USB. I knew I had to go back to original DIN MIDI or find another solution. That solution was the iConnectivity mioXL. It's a MIDI router. It's an intelligent router that does a lot of amazing things. If you're interested in the mioXL, I'll put a link to it in the description below. If you are going to purchase one, please use our affiliate link. We make a few dollars if you use it to buy it or anything else. It is not cheap. It's $400, and there's a reason why it's $400, because it can do amazing things all by itself without even using a DAW. So if you're a studio that is not based using DAWs and you just have hardware sequencers and so on, the mioXL might be a solution for you as well, because it doesn't have to use a DAW. It can, but it doesn't have to. The mioXL is a rack-mounted device. It has a series of DIN MIDI ports and USB ports on the back, as well as a network port. On the front, you can see it has several MIDI ports, more USB ports, and a USB-B port to connect to your computer. It has an OLED display that shows its status, a control knob, and lights that show the various status. And these lights are actually a touch panel, so you can alter what you're looking at depending on what you press. So what makes the mioXL special? It can take input from the DAW, USB, DIN MIDI, or network and route it to any or all of the other input-output ports. Network is especially interesting. You can plug the mioXL into your Ethernet network and it will communicate, and it has 22 RTP ports that appear on your Ethernet network. RTP is real-time protocol. It's an Apple protocol, but it works universally amongst all computers. They supply a driver for Windows, so if you have a Windows PC or Windows DAW, it will work with that as well. Why is that interesting? Because these RTP ports that show up on your network mean that anywhere you have network, you can actually connect to this. If I have Wi-Fi here, so if I wanted to, I could take a tablet on Wi-Fi, connect to a RTP port, and use it to play this Cobalt 8 from upstairs. If I have a DAW running on my laptop on Wi-Fi, I can sit down in my bedroom and operate my studio downstairs here over the network. And it's simply sending and receiving MIDI over that network. If you're working in a live environment or a huge studio where you have multiple studios, you can connect multiple mioXLs, have them all on the network, and they can all talk to each other. And that way, if you set up Studio A that has a bunch of synthesizers and you have Studio B with a bunch of other synthesizers, you can actually connect to each other's synthesizers over MIDI and actually use any of the synthesizers in your entire studio from any of the other studios. If you're working live, the same thing goes. You could have network cables running from the synthesizers on stage, actuating VSTs running on laptops or an Ableton at the front of house over a network, RTP, routed through the mioXL. Why did I actually go with this? Is because it has USB ports. So you can actually take a class-compliant synthesizer, which is any synthesizer that has a class-compliant MIDI driver, which means you don't need drivers to plug it into Windows. You simply plug it in. Windows says, yep, that's a MIDI device. It is class-compliant. It doesn't require custom drivers. Roland Phantom is one of those. You can actually switch it to generic USB mode, which means it's class-compliant. So I can then take the Phantom, a USB cable from it, and plug it directly into the mioXL, and the mioXL will identify that Phantom and say, oh, I see that MIDI device, it's now one of my USB ports. I can then route that into my DAW over the RTP network, and it doesn't use up a USB resource in my computer, so I get around that problem with the USB endpoint limitation. Okay, a quick editing interruption. As I'm editing this video, I realized I'm going to get this question, and so I thought I would interrupt and answer it preemptively. So the USB ports on the mioXL are not the same as the USB ports on your computer. It's not like you get an extension of USB ports from your computer. They are MIDI only. The only thing the USB ports on the mioConnectivity XL will route is actual MIDI information. So for that reason, I don't have all my synths that are capable of talking over MIDI actually running through the mioXL. There are some that I have connected directly into my DAW PC, and the reason for that is that, well, A, they're not MIDI class compliant, or B, they have proprietary software, such as the Modal Cobalt 8X, where it has the Modal app that communicates over USB, and it does all kinds of really great librarian and editing functions and that sort of thing. But that uses actual USB protocol. It is not talking over MIDI, it's actually talking over USB directly to the device. Same thing goes for the wave state and the OP6. They're all connected via USB, and yes, they send MIDI over USB, but they send an awful lot more if you use the manufacturer's application that comes with it. So if you want to use those applications, you have to have the synthesizer plugged into via USB to the computer. You cannot use the USB port on the iConnectivity mioXL. In some cases where I want to use the mioXL, the Cobalt 8X is a good example. I have the DIN MIDI and USB connected. So the USB runs to the DAW, so I can run Modal app while I'm running my DAW, so I can edit the Cobalt 8 settings from my DAW. But I also have the MIDI connected as a DIN MIDI device, and the DAW routes the MIDI data through that. So that way I can have routed MIDI and the Modal app open at the same time. Okay, I hope that makes a little bit more sense. Back to the video. Same thing goes for the DIN MIDI connections. You can connect up all the older synths, like I have my vintage synths over on the other side. I have a Juno 106. It doesn't have USB. USB didn't exist when it was made, but it has MIDI, so the MIDI then runs from there into the iConnectivity mioXL, and then from that into my DAW. So now I have control over the Juno 106 through MIDI via the mioXL. The mioXL has multiple profiles that you can use. It was in a live environment. You could do it for different bands because they have different ways they have their synths set up. Here I've got one DAW profile where my computer runs everything. But I could set up another profile, for instance, so that the Modal Cobalt 8 hits MIDI from it is being routed to the Behringer Model D here, which doesn't have a keyboard, so that I could play the Model D from the Cobalt 8 without actually having to spool up the DAW and have it route the MIDI in between the two. iConnectivity has software that they supply that allows you to configure it. You can connect it by plugging into the USB port here that allows you to connect to it, upgrade the firmware. The software will connect to it, it allows you to configure it. You have to do initially, and once you do that, you can also set up the network connectivity. And then from that point on, you can connect to it, the software over the network, and that's how I run it. So I connected it once, upgraded the firmware, set up the network. Now I connect to it over the network. Let's have a look at that software. So here's what the software looks like. I will say that the documentation for the mioXL is positively atrocious. Their idea of documentation is a bunch of videos, and they're really not great videos. It took me a while to figure out how to actually work this thing. So when you start up the configuration software, which is called Oracle, it will give you a screen that shows you all of the devices that it sees, and they automatically connect. If you have it plugged into the USB, it'll show up. If it's on your network, it will show up because it uses Apple Bonjour to find or Bonjour. That's what it uses to find devices on the network. If we click on the information for this, it will show a picture of the device, what it is, a serial number, and so on, and what firmware it's working. And it shows that I'm connected via RTP. You can also do a factory reset or reboot or what have you. The firmware will obviously say you can't connect over RTP to do firmware updates. You have to do USB. It shows that mine is actually up to date. We'll start with the actual MIDI routing screen because that's where you're going to do most of what you want to do with the mioXL. Once you open it up, you will see on the left, we're talking about inputs and then outputs. So this is entirely routing. So here's all my DIN MIDI ports that it allows me to route. I see here I've got one that I've set up as an SH01. Now these by default are just named 1 through 8 or what have you. You can change the names just by clicking this, so you can name them as to what they are. So obviously I have my SH01, which is my Gaia, set up on DIN port 1. And so any information that is received on the input of SH01, it's going to route and transmit it on RTP MIDI SH01s. And again, the RTP outputs are numbered from 1 to 22. So I just renamed this one SH01. So now I know any input, so when I play a key on the SH01, the MIDI for that is going to get transmitted to RTP MIDI 01. And these are all just all the different ports that the device has. Here's all my DIN MIDI output ports. And you'll notice there's 8 inputs and 12 outputs for the DIN MIDI. There's more outputs than inputs. The USB is the actual USB A ports that are on the mioXL that you can plug in class compliant devices. USB DAW is when you plug in a computer into that USB B port on the front. It has 16 ports that appear as virtual MIDI ports in your DAW that you can use to route. And then, of course, your RTP MIDI, you have 22 that it will route on the network. So as you can see here, if I have anything coming on the DIN MIDI, it's going to send it to RTP MIDI. And my USB MIDI, I have like the Phantom connected to that USB port. And it is actually being sent to host 1, which I don't want, and Phantom USB. So you can see if I just click on this, it will actually select or deselect it. If I wanted to have anything from the Phantom, received on the Phantom, then transmitted to, let's say, I don't know, the Cobalt 8, that's all I would have to do. Now, if I play a key on the Phantom, anything I play is actually going to be routed to the Cobalt 8 as well as to the RTP port here. So if you wanted to set up a master controller that played all of your keyboards, you could do that simply by selecting all of your keyboards here. Every time I click or play anything on the Phantom, it's going to play it simultaneously on all these other devices as well. So obviously I don't want that to happen, so I will deselect that. Now if we scroll down here, you can see I have the USB DAW as well. So if I had any USB connections, which I don't because I'm not using that USB connection, but if I did, I could have it route that from here to anywhere. So I could set up a port that I could name this as test. This would be my test port. And that would show up in my DAW as a MIDI device called test. And then I could tell it to send it to all my DIN MIDI ports. And if I wanted to, I could send it to everywhere. And what would happen then is if any MIDI in my DAW that I routed to the test MIDI port would actually get transmitted simultaneously to all of these devices that I had selected, which obviously is ridiculous. I don't want to do that. But the fact is you could do that sort of thing. So I will change this back because I actually don't want to have test in there. Now here's where the rubber meets the road for me. I use RTP for everything. So all my data in my DAW, all my MIDI ports are routed over RTP. I connect to all the devices via RTP via the mioXL. So the RTP1 is going to show up as an SH01 in my computer, and it gets routed obviously to the SH01. Cobalt 8 gets routed to the Cobalt 8 and so on. Model D gets routed to the Model D over here on USB. And again, I could route the model, if I wanted to, I could say Phantom USB input, anything that gets received on the RTP port, which would be coming from the DAW, could then get sent to wherever. I mean, by default, it's going to obviously be sent to the Phantom, which is what I want, but if I wanted to, I could also send it to the Model D. Now, what you don't want to do, obviously, is set up so the Phantom USB then routes to the Phantom USB, because then you're going to end up with a MIDI loop because it's going to be sending to itself. That's the equivalent of putting a connector, a loopback connector, which you could use for testing, but you wouldn't use that in normal use. Okay, so let's have a little bit of fun here. We're going to go to the presets. I did mention that this mioXL allows you to work with presets. So let's load a blank preset, which is preset 3, and we're going to save that as, and we will rename this as Cobalt 8 to Model D. Oh, I don't have enough. Model D. There we go. Okay, so that's the preset we're working with at the moment. If we go back to MIDI routing, you can see up here it's showing that's the preset we're currently working on. So if we go to our Cobalt 8, where is right there, and currently it's routed by default to DIN 2 and to the RTP MIDI, which I don't want. Where I want that to go is to the Model D. So that's what we've done, and we will go back to presets and we'll save it back as there. So now, if we look at the mioXL, we can see that that's the preset, and we now have selected Cobalt 8 to Model D, and the routing, even though the DAW is not running on the computer, we now have routing that goes directly from the Cobalt 8 over to the Model D here. So I can turn the volume all the way down on the Cobalt 8, but when I play it, it's actually, and you can see the DAW lights, or the lights flashing, showing that MIDI data is being transmitted, and it's actually playing the Model D. And I can change the, I've got the pitch bend and the filter set up. So there's my Model D routing that I can play the Cobalt 8 directly into the Model D without any DAW, and that's purely being done by the mioXL. Now what if there's a conflict between two different synthesizers and the Cobalt was sending stuff to the Model D that was causing it to malfunction? I can change what is actually going to be sent. So I could say, I want to filter out notes on and off for these MIDI channels, which of course, if we do a note, we'll say filter note off, and so that we're only going to send note ons. Now if I press a key on the Cobalt, it stays on because it's never getting through and sending a note off command. So we'll unfilter that, and now there we go. And you can see we can do that for all the different channels separately, or for all channels if you want. Note on, note off, you can get polyphonic keys, CCs if you have any CCs that you want to restrict, or you don't want to send program change or aftertouch or pitch bend or any of these filters. You can filter those out so they can't get through and cause issues. Same thing if you don't want to send a MIDI clock through, if you don't want transport controls such as start and stop and continue, you can filter those. So any sysx, any of this stuff that you want to restrict from being sent to a specific device, you can filter out here. Similarly, you can remap channels. So if we have incoming data on MIDI channel 1, if we want note off on MIDI channel 1 to actually end up on MIDI channel 2, you can do that. That way, if you have MIDI devices that only listen on a specific MIDI channel and you can't change it, but you have a requirement to send on a different MIDI channel, you can remap all this stuff. So if I send everything on channel 2, obviously it's not going to work because the Poly D or the Model D is listening on channel 1, and I can get rid of that. But you can remap all of these things to different MIDI channels internally in the mioXL without having to do any configuration in the synth or in your DAW. It's all just built into this MIDI router. So I'm going to clear everything and go back. Now this is the important part here for if you're going to be using RTP over network. We have to set up all of our RTP ports so that the network, they can be found on the network. So we have to link the RTP ports on the mioXL with the RTP in my DAW PC so that they know how to talk to each other. This is where the documentation on the mioXL really falls flat. So what I was able to do is they also have this other application here called RTP MIDI, and what this does is allows you to set up virtual RTP or virtual MIDI ports that route to RTP. So you can see I've set up different RTP ports here for my various different devices, And once you set it up, it will create a port with a specific port number. You can see it's set up these IP addresses, and for this Cobalt 8, it's on port 5006, and the Phantom's on 5022. You don't have to worry about all this stuff. You basically just create these ports, and it automatically assigns IPs and port numbers dynamically, and it just figures it out. Now, over here, we need to set up the RTP to actually talk to them. So I named each of these ports. You do want to set it up as an initiator because the mioXL is going to be initiating the connection outbound and to your DAW PC. So if you notice, because this is an initiator, when you first turn it on, it's going to reach out and try to find the RTP MIDI application. So here it's for the SH01, which is right here. It's listening on port 5004. Now we've set that up here. The mioXL doesn't know that. So if I turn this off, it now doesn't have a connection to the SH01 RTP port in the computer, but if I turn it on, it's an initiator, it's going to look for it, and there it goes. It's found it. So now there's a connection there between the mioXL and my computer. So when I open my DAW, it's going to route data in and out. If I play something on the SH01, it's going to actually route it to this port on my computer because the mioXL is connected to that port via this screen here. So this is basically just saying, hey, for my RTP stuff, I want you to initiate it in a connection outbound to my DAW PC. That way, every time I turn on the mioXL, it will automatically start connecting and finding all the things it's supposed to connect to and make those connections, and everything will be fine. If I turn off my DAW PC, all these connections are going to disappear, but once I turn it back on, they will all reappear. Same goes if I turn off the mioXL, they'll disappear, obviously because it's turned off, but as soon as you turn it back on, it makes those connections again. Another really quick interruption here. I didn't really get into the responder functionality. So obviously, if it's set to initiator, when the mioXL turns on, it starts the outbound connections to where it's expecting to find things, and it will use Bonjour to look up either names, or you can give it a specific IP address if you already have it set up on your network so that things are always at the same IP address. If you have multiple mioXLs, say multiple devices, you got them all together, or maybe in separate studios, and you want them to talk to each other so they can map ports together, that's where you would have some set up as an initiator and some set up as a responder. So one of the mioXLs you would set up on a specific IP address, and it would be the responder on several ports, and you could give them names and port numbers or what have you. And then one would be the initiator, and so when they both turn on, the initiator would then connect to the responder, and they would establish that connection, and now you could route between the two of them. I know this sounds hopelessly complex. I work in computers for a living, so this makes perfect sense to me, but it may not to you. For the most part, you're not going to have to know or deal with any of this. All you got to do is basically the setup that I just showed you right here, and as soon as you do that, everything just works because they are using Bonjour or whatever. And if you want to use that to connect into your DAW, you use that little Oracle setup utility to set up the individual ports, the virtual ports for the DAW. It gets routed. The mioXL then initiates connections to that. Everything just works. Once you get it set up and working, you don't have to touch it. It just goes, and it really is not as complex as it looks like here, despite what the miserable documentation may have you thinking. Okay, back to the video. All right, the last thing is the USB host reservation, and this is because USB ports don't have a specific number. You can't say, well, of the first 4 ports on the front of the machine, those are going to be ports 1, 2, 3, and 4. It doesn't work that way. All the USB ports are just a blob of ports, it's just a pile of ports, and it just hooks up to whichever one you hook up to. Now what you can see here, as soon as you plug something in, the device itself will identify itself and say, hey, here's the name of my device, and it will automatically show up here. And you can name that port. And what you can do is then say over here, I want to reserve that USB port for this device. That way it knows which port, which device is plugged into which USB port. It will always use that port for that device, and you can then reliably route the port to wherever. So if you can see I have a port name here, Model D. I plugged in my Model D. I said I want this to, by default it says none, but I want it to always connect to the Behringer Model D on this USB port. Reserve that USB port for the Behringer Model D. Call it Model D. That way, when I'm doing my routing and I see my USB here, there's my Model D. I know it's what position it's in. It's on the host port number 2, and it's never going to move around in here to any of these other host ports, which it could do because the USBs are not by default reserved. And that way I can set up the routing the way I always want it. All right, that's my technical overview of the mioXL. I know I did get kind of into the weeds there a bit in how it's configured, but I really didn't find a whole lot of information on this device and how to make it work within your studio when I got it and was setting it up. It took me quite a bit of time, so I thought I would put this video out there so other people who get this, or maybe if you're considering it yourself, have some kind of reference to refer to as to how it works, how to connect it in your studio, how to configure it. So now I've got it set up. I've got my Cobalt 8 running my Poly D. I keep calling it a Poly D. It's a Model D. Monophonic, not polyphonic. My Behringer Model D, it's now controlled by my Cobalt 8. I could set up Aftertouch on there. Actually, could I? Could I set up Aftertouch? I can't really route that to anything. The one thing it doesn't do is it let you route one thing to another. It would be nice if I could set up channel Aftertouch so that it transformed that into a filter. That way you could open a filter just by doing Aftertouch. Can't do that in the mioXL. I could do it in a DAW. There's remapping tools in the DAW to do that, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of a mioXL. But for actually connecting one thing to another in a complex way, the mioXL really excels. It excels. The mioXL. Wow. Okay. The mioXL excels, and I really am pleased with it. It does exactly what I needed it to do. I hope that's of some use to you. If you do like what you saw here, please click like, subscribe, click the little bell. You'll get notified every time we post one of these videos. It really helps us out when you do that. If you have any questions or concerns or anything that I didn't cover or you don't understand, please leave them in the comment section below. I definitely read and answer all those comments, and I really appreciate the amount of participation you guys are doing on my videos. It really makes it feel like I'm doing something worthwhile providing all this information for everybody. Thanks for watching.